We have our first speaker, Amy Rutenberg, who's going to give an overview of World War I. Not knowing where you all were with your curriculum, we thought it might be best to start with kind of a general overview. Then we have Matthew Schaefer who's going to talk about President Herbert Hoover's involvement during World War I prior to his presidency. And then Jack Lufkin is going to talk about the black officer training at Fort Des Moines. This is kind of a piece of history that's flown under the radar, and so we're bringing it to the surface. So without further ado, please help me welcome Amy Rutenberg to the stage.
Hi all, thanks for having me. So just so that I know, by show of hands, how many of you have covered World War I in any way, shape, or form in class? Okay, good, most of you. So hopefully this is mostly review. I actually want to start with my family, the Rutenberg family here, taken about 1927. This guy right here is my grandfather, Mort. This is my great-grandfather, Mo, and this is my great-grandmother, Rose. And I bring them up because they are the Rutenberg family. Rutenberg's a German name. It roughly translates to Red Mountain. And as family lore has it, Rose and Mo there sat down at one point and seriously considered changing the family name from Rutenberg to Redmont. They ultimately decided not to, but this has been sort of one of those mind games that people in my family have played. What would have happened if I were Amy Redmont instead of Amy Rutenberg? Would I be somebody different? Right? Why would somebody actually sit down at the kitchen table or somewhere else and contemplate changing their name? And the answer, in my family's case, and in a whole lot of other families' cases, is World War I. And so I just wanted to start there to give you a sense. So I'm going to run through the causes of the war in Europe. Hopefully you have covered them. Your teachers can relate that 25 minutes to cover why World War I is kind of an absurd idea, but going to try. So reason number one is imperialism. By 1913, most of the territories of the world had been divided up, and you can sort of get a sense of how they'd been divided up based on this map. But even though they're, not fighting over giant chunks of land, everyone, all of the great powers of Europe are still in competition with each other. They're looking for greater territorial, greater political, greater economic resources, and there are all kinds of border skirmishes around the world and also a lot of posturing back in Europe. There was a really strong belief that if your empire wasn't growing, you were losing. You were becoming weaker. That the amount of power in the world is completely finite. And so if someone gets more power, it automatically means that someone else has to have less power. And so your job as a great power European nation, don't lose power. So to keep from falling behind, the great powers of the world start making alliances with each other. This was the best map I could find. It shows Italy on this side after 1915. Italy had allied itself in the beginning with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And then the other side lined up pretty much as France, England, and Russia. And there are a whole series of alliances that have to do with that. Cause number two of World War I is nationalism. As you've probably learned, nationalism is a feeling of fierce pride in your country, but it goes beyond patriotism. It's a belief that your country is not only the best, but that everything your country does ought to make your country more powerful. Or, if you don't have a country, right, it encompasses the idea that you and people like you ought to be independent, ought to have your own country. This shows up in World War I with Serbia. Serbia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but there were ethnic Serbs in other places. The Serbs themselves believed that they should have their own sort of greater Serbia, separate and apart from Austria-Hungary. That idea makes the great powers very nervous, right? They're all colonial powers. They want to hang on to what they've got, but the people who are part of that empire maybe don't want to be there, right? So major powers are nervous as a result of that. And then militarism. Militarism is the idea that military operations are a legitimate it's a legitimate tool of foreign relations, either through the threat of war or through war itself. And it goes beyond spending, although, to be clear, military spending increased by 50% in Europe and all of the great powers between 1908 and 1913. So there's massive money being poured into the building of tanks to some extent. They're just starting to figure out what these are, but into artillery weapons, particularly small arms. They spend less on ammunition for some reason, but whatever. And it goes beyond spending, though. It's about shifting the entire social structure and economic structure of the country itself. In Germany, for example, all horses were designated part of the reserve, right? Because at the time, you're still using horses to move things from point A to point B. So if you mobilize the military, you need horses. So you put all the horses that are owned by people into the military reserve. They can be called up, just like soldiers can, right? I chose this particular picture because this is down in Rhodesia, which is a British holding. And so the point here is that it becomes a world war. When you carry over that militarism into the colonies too, then you get people who have become involved from places not just in Europe. And so by 1914, European nations were 1, vying for supremacy, 2, allied against and with one another, and 3, really well armed. So you put those pieces together, and when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and his wife Sophie are assassinated by a Serbian nationalist, it's enough to kick off the war, right? People are upset, the alliances sort of shift into place, and so one thing leads to another, and you have a cascade of countries declaring war on each other. The US, however, in 1914, when the war breaks out, was really interested in staying neutral. To be frank, World War I was a mess. There were plenty of pictures of terrible things happening in the trenches that I could put up here, but I decided rats would be a good way to go because, 1, it's a little less disturbing, and 2, it's gross. The terrier here caught all these giant rats in the trenches. In other words, Americans really were engaged in letting the Europeans fight it out amongst themselves. And then, of course, you have the question of what side is the US going to be on? It wasn't obvious that it would be the Allied side, right? If you look at the American population in 1914, almost 11 million Americans had at least one parent, or perhaps themselves, were from Germany, Austria-Hungary, or Italy. Okay, just over 10 million Americans had one parent from England, France, or Russia. So in other words, there are more Americans who are trace their immediate ancestry back to the other side than to the Allied side. And individual alliances aren't simple. Irish Americans, for example, right? They don't like the British because the British had basically encompassed them, had taken them over. Ireland wants independence, so Ireland's not too fond of England. So what side are the Irish going to be on in America? So it makes sense to maintain neutrality. However, neutrality was something that was super difficult to hang on to, right? So trade is one of those things that comes up. By the usual laws of war, right, the way that it had been done for centuries, right, a belligerent nation can trade with a neutral nation, and neutral nations can trade with all the belligerents in a war. So in theory, the US feels like, hey, our ships can go and our stuff can go on, German ships to Germany, English ships to England, French ships to France, and we can bring our own US ships to wherever, and we can carry whatever we want because, hey, we're neutral. Right? However, that doesn't work super well with the advent of submarine warfare. By the old laws of war, right, a ship that was going to stop another ship and board it, you would say, hey, I'm the German ship, I'm stopping you, English ship, all the Americans, get off. I'm about to sink this ship. Right? But the whole point of submarine warfare is that it's secret. The submarine doesn't surface and say, hey, we're here, right? They shoot their torpedoes from under the water, and the whole point is that it's secret. So that doesn't work. And so although the Germans, who are the ones using the submarines, the U-boats, tried to do the things that everyone had done in the past, like run advertisements in the newspapers saying, hey, Americans, stay off British ships, who's going to listen? Right? Pretty much nobody. So when a British passenger liner called the Lusitania, which I assume you've heard of, was sunk by a German U-boat, and it kills 128 Americans, including 37 women and 21 children, of the about 1,200 people that died, it sent an uproar, it sent up a furor. The Germans were like, we warned you, and besides, that ship is not, in fact, so neutral. or it's not just a passenger liner, it's not just a cruise ship, it's not just the Love Boat. As it turns out, it was carrying thousands of cases of small arms. So it was carrying weaponry to one side, and the Germans were on the other side, and they said, sink, right? But it was a moment when a lot of Americans started demanding war. This is 1915. The US does not enter the war in 1915. All right. President Woodrow Wilson of the US issues a series of statements, they're known as the Lusitania statements, demanding the stop of submarine warfare. And there's a whole series of diplomatic incidents that happened between 1915 and 1916, and eventually the Germans back down. In 1916, they say, all right, we're going to stop our unrestricted submarine warfare. Wilson is reelected in 1916 as the president who kept us out of war. But neutrality remains really difficult. The British had cut the transatlantic cables that carried news under the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. So most of the news that's coming into the US is coming in through Britain. It's coming in through Allied sources, okay? Including a whole bunch of propaganda. So you end up seeing, and you'll hear about this, I would assume, in a couple of moments, about the horrors of the Germans in Belgium, right? Here are some propaganda. These are British, right? But the idea here is that the Germans are destroying Belgium. They're killing women and children. It's terrible. And this is the news that's filtering back into the United States. There's also the part where most Americans do speak English, right? And so there's, and a lot of Americans do trace their sort of heritage back to the Mayflower and Jamestown and you know, this sort of British, even legal tradition, and where does the Constitution come from, and this idea of a Bill of Rights, and stuff like that. It's coming, people think, you know, from England. So you add that to the Zimmerman telegram, and things just sort of begin to snowball on top of each other. So the Zimmerman telegram, it's one of these crazy sort of diplomatic things that happens. So Arthur Zimmerman is the German foreign secretary, and he sends a telegram to Mexico saying, look, we are about to resume our unrestricted submarine warfare. The Americans, not going to like it very much. We're hoping they stay neutral, but they may not. So if they don't, how would you, Mexico, like to declare war on the United States? That would be a great idea, because Mexico, you can slow down the Americans from joining our war. That will allow us, the Germans, to go ahead and win this war in Europe. And since you will have been allied with us, you can get back New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, which got taken from Mexico, well, not quite 100 years, but many years earlier, right? This sounds great, doesn't it, Mexico? Mexico kind of blew it off. But the British intercepted this cable. They decoded it, and then eventually they held on to it for a little while. They waited until that unrestricted submarine warfare had started up again, and the Americans were already beginning to be upset, and then the British gave it to the Americans. At which point, combined with a series of sinkings of American merchant ships, the US, Wilson, went to Congress and said, look, I think it's time for a declaration of war. Right? And so he goes on April 2nd to Congress. The House, I think, passes on the 4th, and the Senate passes on the April 6th, yesterday, 100th anniversary, right? Why we're all here. The thing is, and just a brief overview of American involvement in the war itself was fairly limited. War is declared in April 1917. A few American soldiers are sent over by summer, but in general, the American military is small and weak in 1917. It's got to grow, and it's got to grow quickly. So it's not until spring 1918 that US troops arrive in Europe in any kind of number to do anything. And in November 1918, armistice is declared. So though Americans are involved in some very important battles, although a lot of Americans do perish in those battles, in terms of actual length of service, this war is short for the US. But the US does help break the stalemate on the Western Front, right? They'd been bogged down in these trenches for years. Millions of people are dying at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, 1.5 million people died over a 7-mile stretch of land, right? So the scale of it is just mind-blowing. And it's the fact that the Americans are entering with their men, with their manpower, with their materials, with their sort of fresh eyes, with their ability, it's not so much what the Americans did in battle that won the war, it was the threat that there would be more Americans coming that sort of began the process of ending the war. But the thing is that Americans in 1916 had elected a president saying, I'm going to keep you out of war. And then it's 1917, and that president says, hey, let's go to war. How do you mobilize the people to do that? What does it do? How do you get the majority of Americans to get behind this war? The answer, truthfully, propaganda, right? You have to sell the war, particularly to those who maybe have family in now the enemy countries, right? So the Committee for Public Information is created. It's run by a guy named George Creel. And he and Wilson basically settle on this idea that we are going to sell the war as a war of idealism. It's a war to end all wars. It's a war for democracy, to bring freedom and liberty to the people of Europe, and it'll be an idealistic war. And that's this particular propaganda poster here, right? This idea that liberty shall not perish from the earth by Liberty Bonds. And there are all different kinds of ways that the CPI gets involved in trying to sell this war, right? Here's a propaganda poster. Who is this specifically talking to? Anybody? Immigrants, exactly, right? The United States is and was a nation of immigrants. You have over 20 million people who trace at least one parent back to a European nation. So the idea here is that, they came here for a reason. Let's think about what that reason is, and let's support the United States. And for the very most part, vast majorities of people, regardless of where they came from, they got on board. But the problem is that the CPI also had a tendency to go a little too far. Okay, Germans are demonized. And if German Americans were not able to show their particular loyalty to the United States in the ways that some extra specially patriotic people wanted, it created some problems. So you see all kinds of ways that Germany is sort of pushed out and pushed to the edges. German citizens are made to register with the government and disclose their bank accounts. Laws, most notably the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, were passed making it illegal to criticize the government, the draft, or any aspect of the war. Can you imagine that? Think about, so last night, President Trump ordered the use of Tomahawk missiles on Syria, right? There's all kinds of debate in the media today about whether that was a good decision or a bad decision or a somewhere in the middle decision. None of that debate would have been legal after the passage of these two laws, right? So think about that for a minute. Patriotic societies demonized Germany and all things German. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. Hamburgers became Liberty sandwiches. Dachshunds became Liberty pups. Orchestras stopped playing German music, including Beethoven and Bach. Towns and streets were renamed. So Berlin, Iowa, renamed Lincoln, Iowa. You will not find Berlin, Iowa on the map anymore. Businesses were renamed. The German Savings Bank was renamed the Lincoln Savings Bank, which is a common bank here in Iowa. And in the state of Iowa, the legislature passed a law forbidding the use of German in any public forum, including churches, schools, and even on the telephone. It was called the Babel Proclamation, from the Tower of Babel. Right, and this is the environment in which, let me put it this way. This was successful. There was incredible support for the war. It is debatable whether things like the Babel Proclamation were particularly necessary. And in fact, if you go out to the Germans in Iowa exhibit that's out there, it talks specifically about this. It's a really neat exhibit that was put together. But with the loss of German culture in the United States as a result of this, this is the environment, by the way, that prohibition ends up being passed, the abolition of alcohol, because who are the beer companies? Anheuser-Busch, Pabst, Schlitz. These are German names. So it's not by accident that prohibition gets passed on a national level right on the tail end of World War I. But this is also why the Rutenbergs considered changing their name, right? So it has effects. It has all kinds of effects. World War I has all kinds of effects on the big stage, which is, I think, sort of where we usually see it in school and in the big books and on the documentaries on the History Channel. But it had effects for people, like real people, like my grandparents type people, my great-grandparents type people. And I think that that's some of what these other talks are going to get at, and part of what the exhibits that you guys are going to look at also have to deal with. So with that, I will say I will take questions at the end. So next up.
You guys probably don't realize what an awesome job that was. To take all of World War I in a global event and compress it into 25 minutes and have it be coherent. I would applaud again. I'm Matt Schaefer. I'm from the Hoover Library. I'm going to throw a question out. You all are bright, aspiring history students of some sort. Tell me one thing about Herbert Hoover. Fire away.
He was born in Iowa.
Two things. Second thing. When was he president? Actually, no. During the Great Depression. This is what Hoover is known for in America. This is my frame. This is how I begin all of my discussions about Hoover. If you know one thing about him, president during the Great Depression. Ask your grandparents. You know, they probably didn't vote for him the second time. Nobody would. But in World War I, Herbert Hoover hadn't become the greatest, or hadn't joined that list of the 10 worst presidents in American history. He was an Iowa guy by birth, but not by any sort of definition. He defined himself as a Californian as World War I broke out. And where do we begin? We begin with him born here in West Branch, orphaned at age 9, gets on a train, goes to Oregon, lives with his uncle for the next 6 years, goes to Stanford to become study geology, become a mining engineer. He chose Stanford because it was tuition free. He goes out into the world, makes a fortune as a mining engineer. He is, by the time he's 35 years old, probably the richest self-made man in America. One of his mates from Stanford wrote and said, Burt, old boy, it's rumored that you're worth $10 million. How can a man your age be worth so much? And he writes back, George, no one our age could have earned $10 million, honestly. I'm worth but 5, which is one of my favorite Hoover letters in all the collection. It's a humble brag. I wish you all have the luck to make that statement. I have a map of the world here in a very gross way, showing, backwards. Okay. Hoover is based in London as a mining engineer, but he has enterprises in Russia, in China, in Burma, in Australia, in South Africa, in the Western Hemisphere. He has traveled around the world 7 times by the time he's 35 years old. And he's made $5 million, and he's tired of the game of making money. This is back in a day when you could do that. You could be tired of making money. And he sends a letter to his friend and says, I'm interested in getting into public service. Can you sort of float my name around in the States? And this friend of his says, well, there's this thing called the Bureau of Mines, just created by Taft's government. I'll send him a letter letting him know that you're interested. Well, Taft, the president, chose one of his friends from the coal industry, and Hoover said, rats. But don't let them forget me. So again, Hoover's name is floated in D.C. in 1913 when President Wilson says, I need someone to oversee, basically review the production and building of the Panama Canal. And again, Hoover has his name floated. Wilson says, I've got somebody else to do that. So here's our guy, Burt, as a 37-year-old, looking dapper, ready to get into the bigger game of public service. Public service ultimately finds Hoover. In World War I, When World War I breaks out, he's in London with his wife and 2 kids. When war breaks out, stuff happens. 1, banks close. Travel is interdicted. When World War I broke out in August 1914, there were roughly 100 to 120,000 Americans in Europe doing the Continental Tour. This is old custom for people of some means. When war breaks out, we see a German blockade in the North Sea and in the North Atlantic. We see a British blockade a little bit farther out, again, setting up the outer limits of war, with 100,000 people in London saying, or 100,000 people in Europe, many of them getting back to London saying, I gotta get home. I don't want to spend any more time in a war zone than I have to. And Hoover is tapped by the American ambassador, sets up the American Residence Committee, and begins the process of getting people resources and tickets to go back home to America. This is how Hoover spends the first 6 weeks of the war. His wife is right there. She sets up the Resident American Women's Committee to help destitute American women, teachers primarily, and students in college, to get back stateside. Hoover does this basically on his own initiative, with his own money, with the idea these people will pay him back. He loans about $120,000 in August and September of 1914 and gets paid back all but $130 of that over the course of the next several months. Funny stories, there was one woman there who was pissed that she was going to be sent back in steerage. Okay, boats, we saw the Lusitania, first class, you're above, you can get out on deck. Second class, you're a bit closer to the waterline. Third class, or steerage, you're basically never going to see the light of day for the 6 days you're on the ship. And this woman was a woman of means, said, I will not go back in steerage, and went on a hunger strike. Hoover had her, said, that's fine, do what you follow your conscience, had her sit outside the restaurant at the Hotel Savoy in London. Her hunger strike lasted about 7 hours. So, okay, on with the show. The first thing, Hoover's first action for the first 8 weeks of the war, get Americans back stateside. His second action, again, at the behest of the American ambassador in London, who says, my God, we've got a catastrophe brewing in Belgium. Belgium, a tiny country. I was going to point to it on a map when Amy had it up, but it was invisible to my eye from row number 1. It's a tiny sliver of land between Germany and France. Awkward when World War I breaks out, because the shortest line for Germany to invade France would have been through northern France, but the French, having been invaded in 1870, defended that line, the Maginot Line. So Germany said, something gets in my way, I go around it, rolled through Belgium. And Belgium, not a world power in any stretch of the imagination in 1914, that while they had colonies in Africa, their army was minuscule and ill-equipped to deal with Germany. They were hammered. And so Belgium, by the fall of 1914, by late October, is facing starvation. Because what happens in a war? You set fire to the fields, so there's no resistance behind you. You set up checkpoints, you set up choke points, papers please, papers please. Belgium ends up in the propaganda, ends up basically crushed. The American ambassador says they don't have food to last them through Christmas. Hoover, when tapped, says the 3 kindest words in the English language. 3 kindest words in the English language might be, I love you, no, can I help? And spends what he thinks is going to be the next several months. He goes into the CRB thinking he's going to organize this agency to get through the next 4 or 5 months, get Belgium fed, and then get on with his life. Because the last European war lasted a matter of weeks. What he didn't realize was that he was entering the slippery slope to public service that was going to take him for the next 3.5 years, organizing the Commission for Relief in Belgium, which was set up as a private relief agency run by a private citizen voluntarily, marshaling people from neutral nations. We go back to what Amy was talking about, that alliance system. War means world war. War means war on all fronts. If you're neutral, you have some latitude in what you can do in a war zone. But what Hoover does is basically walks into the line of fire and says, these are innocent civilians, 3 million kids, 3 million women, they're not combatants. Let me organize a food relief effort to get them fed. And he does so with the CRB, which is, at that time, the largest food relief effort in history. Hoover in his life is going to organize the largest food relief effort in history 3 different times. If he did nothing else, that would be a pretty commendable effort. Now, you'll see the ship here, Belgian Relief, not flying any flags, no national flags. The CRB was its own flag. It was a neutral state, a piratical state for benevolence, is how it was called by George Nash. So when the ship would be stopped on the seas, they could argue, look, no arms, no war material, nothing to do with the war, it's food for Belgium. Let the ship pass. When we were talking about a blockade where that's how you stop material from getting into war zones, that was a useful tool. And it worked for the most part. Only 7 CRB ships were sunk before January 1917. January 1917 is kind of a pivot point for American and world events in World War I. It's when unrestricted submarine warfare was resumed. Millions need bread, and this, I think, is one of the earliest propaganda photos. This was the cover of a book by Edward R. Hunt called War Bread. This little Belgian girl having her sustenance for the day, a slice of hard rye bread. The bread line here, I like this because the next time bread lines show up in Hoover's life, they're in America in 1930. Inside Hoover humor. Okay, challenges to meet. He's got to negotiate all of this as a private citizen for a neutral nation. He has to convince the British that, yeah, it's all right to bring food in to these starving citizens. The British are saying, including Winston Churchill, what? No, that's Germany's problem. The rules of war, and I love Amy mentioning rules of war. We don't think of rules of war as exist anymore. In 1914, there were such things. There were the Geneva Conventions. That wasn't just Hogan's Heroes. And the conventions were neutral citizens are not combatants. You don't set fire to their villages. You don't take you don't take action against non-combatants. The Britons are saying, all right, that means if they're behind German lines, Germany has to feed them. Well, Germany has trouble enough feeding its army. It's not going to feed independent citizens. And the publicity, the PR stuff, the propaganda, if you will, we're not showing, we're showing this poor blind mother trying to take care of her daughter, God, how hard would your heart have to be not to reach into your pocket and give this poor person a nickel? Have you done your bit for Belgium? And here's a rank of Belgian orphans saying, more, please, more. And Hoover is in London and traveling back and forth between Brussels, between Rotterdam, between Paris, London, Berlin, organizing this food relief. I love this shot here. All the cooks are men, all the servers, women. This is a Belgian food warehouse showing the tens of thousands of tons of flour delivered. At its peak, the CRB was moving 120,000 tons of food a month across the Atlantic. Just to give you some sense of the scale. The Belgians are delighted, because this is their great hope. They're going to survive this war because of the CRB. And they send notes of thanks and photos of thanks, and you'll see there's the American flag in this little orphanage here. It's hard to see, but that's the American flag, that's the Belgian flag. Flour sacks decorated and sent as notes of gratitude back for Hoover. Hoover wasn't a sentimental guy. He traveled the world. We don't have much to document his early life as a mining engineer in Australia. We have 400 of these flour sacks in our museum. That's the only thing we have really from World War I that's not made, that's not paper-based or document. this actually had a lot of meaning for Hoover. I looked hard for an Iowa one. I failed to find one. Iowa did do their bit for the CRB. Hoover was a mining engineer and a numbers guy. So at the end of the war, when he started tallying up, he actually tallied state by state and sometimes town by town contributions made to the CRB. Iowa, there was actually a relief for Belgian commission started before the CRB. It was created by the governor in the middle of 1914, October. And over the next 3.5 years, it donated $125,000 to the CRB. And Hoover accounted for this because he understood doing this work, millions of dollars, literally almost $1 billion passed through the CRB coffers. And he said, look, people are going to look at us and say they grafted on this money. We must be totally open and above board. We must account to this down to the last nickel. His metaphor was we must have glass pockets and pure hearts. And when he accounted for it in Iowa, the one I remember was Grinnell College students and citizens gave $85.06 to the CRB. 6 cents. That's, and there was the Burlington Tin Cup, the school kids in Burlington, Iowa. They had a little tin cup fundraising drive, $15.75, which again I think is a pretty precise measure. Oh, Christ on a crutch. Oh, there we go. You've never heard that? Stick with me. I'll take you places in the English language can only be remotely assessed. All right. America stays out of the war until April 1917, for all the reasons that Amy laid out. But Hoover and Wilson and the people in Wilson's cabinet see that America is edging closer to war beginning in January 1917. And they're thinking, all right, all this stuff that we've negotiated for the CRB, predicated on this guy being a private citizen from a neutral nation, that's going to go into a cocked hat. What are we going to do if that comes to play? Wilson has seen the good that Hoover can do, and he says, if war comes, I want Hoover on my side, managing food on our side of the water, because I understand that he's a genius at this, and we all know that food is a weapon in this war. Food will win the war. As much as bullets, as much as battleships, food is a weapon. So this is Hoover and his family. Those are his boys. There's his wife. There's his 2 boys. He meets with Wilson in January while Hoover's on this side of the water asking to raise money for the CRB. Wilson says, "I've got a plan for you, but it has to wait until we're in the war." Hoover is intrigued. But he's also got to wrap up business with the CRB. He goes back. Travels back to Europe in March 1917, March 13th, gets on okay, let's set the context. Unrestricted submarine warfare begins really in earnest in February 1917. German ships are taking down tons and tons of shipping. We're taking down 20 or 30 ships a week, including 5 to 7 American ships. Okay, if you have a vessel and it's in an American port, and the Germans are taking them down, you think twice before sending a multi-million-dollar ship across the Atlantic through U-boat-infested waters. So when Hoover wanted to get back to Europe, the only ship he could get was an old Spanish freighter, the Antonio Lopez. And he gets on this ship, he boards it in Brooklyn. It's sailing for Cadiz, so it's basically going to miss the most contentious waters in the North Atlantic. His wife packs him a lunch, basically, says, look, I know you're going to a food-starved place. Here's some butter, here's some meat, here's some fresh vegetables. Hoover comes onto the ship with this stuff and looks for the steward to have it put into cold storage. The steward looked at him blankly. 1, the steward only spoke Spanish. 2, cold storage? This is a 40-year-old freighter. We don't have no stinking cold storage. And Hoover realized after he boarded the ship, oh, all of their meat is on 4 hooves and in the front of the boat, buying and bleeding on. He writes in his memoirs a wonderful description, of the sounds. I described them as a bovine orchestra protesting the rough passage. The smells. He said, I'll never, as long as I live, forget the smell of that ship. And also, he discovered that it wasn't just 4 hooved animals on board. It had a full contingent of rats and roaches that got into his food, and he never really got to eat the food. Sidebar. Meets with Wilson. He comes back stateside in May, meets with Wilson in May 1917. Wilson says, I want you to be in charge of food conservation and distribution in the United States, work with the Secretary of Agriculture. Hoover says, man, that's divided responsibility means nobody's accountable. I can't take the job on those terms. Hoover says, I'll take this job, but I have to be basically the food czar. I have to be absolutely in charge. People report to me. I'm willing to have the Secretary of Agriculture report to me. I'll work with him, but the only person I want to report to is Wilson. And Wilson's saying, man, it took me a week to get a declaration of war through the Senate. I'm really this is going to take some time. And Wilson spends a lot of political capital over the next 3 months getting the U.S. Food Administration set up so that Hoover would take it on. August 10th, it's Hoover's birthday, another inside Hoover joke, is named the food czar, and he's going to spend the next 15 months organizing and consolidating food conservation, distribution in America, because he understands if we can get food to Europe, it's going to have a bigger impact on the war than troops, because what was the American Army's size in like 1917? I'm looking at Jack. It was tiny, right? Like 140,000? 140,000. I mocked the Belgian Army at the outset. The Belgians had a bigger army than America in 1914. Not in 1917, the Belgian Army was crushed, but in 1914, they had a bigger army than America. Belgium, point to it on a map. Understands food will win the war. So he organizes this voluntary effort, state by state, county by county, spends a lot of time mobilizing women. Why women? Because women controlled food in the American household. He understood that if he had the women on his side, he was going to get a lot farther along. So he promoted in freedom's name, use corn, oats, potato, barley, rye, eat fish, egg, game, beans. What's being taken out of your menu here? Sugar, meat, and wheat. Wheatless Wednesdays. Ring a bell for anybody? Meatless Mondays. Okay, these were things that Hoover's PR department and Hoover's Food Administration championed. They show up in the fall of 1917, 21 meals a week if you're having 3 squares a day. By the beginning of 1918, 14 of those meals had strictures on them in Hoover's dietary recommendation. By the middle of 1918, 19 of those meals. So, pretty far-reaching. Food fight! You are... Sorry. You guys are too young. Okay, food fight on many fronts. Production, distribution, conservation. How does Hoover win these people over? He works with the big granaries. He works with the big distribution folks like Pillsbury, and works hard to have them improve their shipping and harvesting. Meatless Mondays. Here we have the Wednesday, all meals wheatless, 1 meal meatless. Gets the merchants to pledge. He gets homes to pledge to save the wheat, save the meat, save the oil, save the sugar. And does this all by tapping into a newly emerging, sorry, I'm going to skip by that, posters, propaganda. This is a poster that would have been in a store, Eat All the Food on Your Plate, the Clean Plate Club. Anybody have a Clean Plate Club mother besides me? You know, eat all the food on your plate? Only the old folks, I guess. I don't know. This is one of my favorite artifacts from our museum here. It is a Valentine. I can Hoover Eyes on dinners and on lights and fuel too, but I'll never learn to Hoover Eyes when it comes to loving you. Sweet. Food does win the war. Ultimately, America doubled its food export to Europe between 1917 and 1918. And this effort, as Amy quickly alluded to, was pivotal. in breaking the stalemate and leading to negotiated settlement in November 11th, 1918. Germany sues for peace. Unfortunately, peace does not bring the end to hunger in Europe. There's still chaotic situations in Eastern Europe, and Hoover has to take the mechanisms that he's set up with the CRB and the US Food Administration and morph it into the American Relief Administration, which is going to once again take food from across the Atlantic, and this time rather than taking it into Belgium and Rotterdam, taking it in far deeper into Eastern Europe, deep into the Mediterranean, and into the Middle East and North Asia. This is a much greater logistical challenge on two fronts. One, it's a longer supply line. Two, the war had left most rail lines and a lot of the ports in that part of the world devastated. And three, there's this thing called the Russian Revolution, which is, I love that the map here shows that in red, because the Red Army is moving to exert influence into Eastern Europe at this time. There are lots, it's a chaotic situation. Oh, and did I mention, whereas Belgium fed 6 to 8 million people over the course of World War I, 80 million people need food at this juncture. But Hoover's the guy. I'm going to skip through all that. He has now, at this point, had 7 years' experience raising money for food relief. He's got it down to a science. His genius part here is this food package where you can give $10 here, anywhere, to the ARA. And the ARA was kind of a global, it was a macro organization that organized the American Red Cross Relief, the Jewish Joint Distribution, what was left of the CRB. And you put your $10 on the table here, and they will send, I don't know if you can read this here, basically 120 pounds of flour, rice, beans, condensed milk, lard. That's good eating. To a specific location or family in Europe. Okay, we'll go back to what Amy said. 20 million Americans have a generation back been Europeans. You can send it to your grandmother in Lodz or Warsaw. And this is another Hoover innovation. In late 1920, and Hoover is still now, he's still in Europe. He's been in Europe for, well, he missed most of his kids' teen years. I've often wrestled with, was that a strategy? 3.5 million people, kids primarily, are facing starvation in Eastern Europe. And he says, here's my plan. We will have these fundraising dinners in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in New Haven, and for the price of admission, I will feed you a 963-calorie meal for your $100 a plate dinner, and I will take the money and we will give it to our invisible guest. That empty plate, that empty chair at the table representing one of those millions of European families in desperate need of food. The invisible guest movement between December 1920 and February 1921 raised $30 million of private money. Hoover's goal was $33 million. He called off the fundraising when he realized, commodity prices are going down. We only need $29.7 million. Stop asking for money. Because people are getting tired. I mean, we're talking about that America had been giving money to feed Europe at this point for 7 years. Wrapping up Hoover. Between 1914 and 1922, headed two of the largest food relief efforts in history, nominated for the Nobel Prize. Didn't win it. It was easier to get nominated back in those days. You just had to have some academic somewhere say, you know who'd be a good Nobel Prize winner? Stalin got nominated. Hitler got nominated. Hoover got nominated. Goes on, his public service, the slippery slope that he stepped on in August 1914 continued. He serves as Commerce Secretary from 1921 to 28, President from 1929 to 33, leads the largest food relief effort in history after World War II, feeding, organizing UNICEF and helping to feed over 200 million people. Thank you. I'll take questions at the end. Jack, I left you more time.
You got to go through one more speaker, and I'll talk for just about half of the time, and you'll see a part of a film I put together last year. So now we'll go talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the military part, and no images to see yet. I want to talk just generally just about what the Army had to put up with, what the Army had to do to get ready for the war. As your first speaker talked about, how they had to get the Army over there fast. So let's talk about why they had to get there fast and what they generally had to do. And so we're talking about, we declared war in April of 1917. And at that time, the Germans were fighting what you might say a two-front war. They were fighting the Russians on their eastern end, and on their western end, I got to make sure I get this right. Yeah, the western end, they were fighting the French, and that's where most of the fighting was. This massive trench, you saw that image of those horrible rats and the terrier. So there was this huge, massive line of trenches, I don't know, hundreds of miles, or was it 1,000 miles? It was primarily defensive war. Neither side could break through the other side. It was like a stalemate. And so they were fighting the British and the French, and the British had their sector, and the French had their sector. And it was, and they tried multiple offenses and had horrible, massive casualties, and neither side could break through. That was their idea. If they could break through and get behind the lines of the other, and they could deliver a knockout blow. They kept thinking they could do that with these attacks. It just never happened. But once the Russians were out of the war on the western end, the Germans had sensed this golden opportunity. They could really do it now, and do it before the Americans got there. And so they had hundreds of thousands of troops on the Russian front, and if they could load them into trains and move them over there before the Americans got there, because then they had this big influx of numbers that they could do it. So that was kind of the idea. And the Germans thought, well, here we got this big idea, and so that was the idea. So that's what they wanted to do. So the Americans, so there's a lot of pressure on the Americans, and they had this. We really had a puny army. Now we have a massive armed forces. I think we're bigger than any 5 countries' budgets and military put together now. But now we didn't have it like that then. So we were faced with basically bringing well over 1 million guys, and it was guys. Women weren't in the services yet. That starts to happen in World War II. But training, equipping with very few facilities. What does training an army involve? Think about it. These are all right. And they were drafting them. So you take a test, see if you're physically fit. You take some aptitude test, and then you go to. They tell you to report to some place at basic training. Places they had to build, like Camp Dodge. You ever been up to Johnston? That was just a thought that was barely even developed. That was one of a number of places where they assigned people to go for basic training. So you had to learn how to drill. They had to give you a uniform. They had to go to some company to make the uniforms, and they had to feed you, and they had to build buildings where your food came out the other end, because they had to build those places too. Just think about all the details. They had to find the food, and they had to purchase weapons and guns, and if you think of all the details of living your life, and had to have people to train you, and all that takes a number of months, and then you're just barely a soldier, and you don't even have any combat experience yet. Oh, and one other detail, you have to get in a boat and go 2,000 miles across the ocean to get there. And then when you get to France, then they have to figure out where to put you on the battle lines. So there's a lot of enormous detail, and they did it. And they brought well over 1 million people, guys, over there, and they actually made a difference. And that is a staggering accomplishment. And even though we weren't there all that long, as the first speaker, Amy, said, we didn't really get there, and it took us well over a year, maybe 15 months before we were really there in great numbers. It was an amazing accomplishment with the technology much more crude compared to today. You couldn't text somebody to tell them to report somewhere. It was, well, they had telegraphs, but But that's what the Army was facing. And so, but one of the many details, annoying in a way for the Army at the time, was they instituted a draft, and one problem they had to do is, what are we going to do with the African Americans that were drafted? Because and I say that, and I don't mean that in a prejudicial way, but I do for them at that time, because here's what the condition of the Army was. Even though it was small, the Army was completely segregated. So what does that mean? Tell me, what do I mean when I say segregated Army? Anybody want to guess, or do you know? I want to hear it. Come on, somebody say it. Say what? Yeah, so what does that mean? Let's say if you were black and you joined the Army, what do you think you could expect? Yeah, how did that translate? How would the racism translate to being in the Army or the Navy? There was no Air Force yet, by the way. Okay, what it meant is you could only be in certain units. If you were in so all the certain combat divisions were all white, meaning you weren't allowed in. Let's say you took an aptitude test, which you all did. If you joined the Army, they wanted to find out what you were good at or bad at or couldn't do too well at. Let's say you scored really well as maybe a potential machine gunner in a machine gun unit, but if they were all white, just forget about it. You didn't have a chance. They wouldn't train you to do that. If you were going to maybe join the Navy and you're good at maybe navigation principles, forget it. You just didn't even, they didn't even consider you because you check marked the box that said you were a, quote, Negro. That was the term they used at the time. So that's what African Americans expected. And so they had to think, God, what are we going to do with all these guys? There's going to be hundreds of thousands of them. They're citizens, so we have to do something with them. So that was one of the many, many details, the logistical details they had to deal with. And the African American political leaders were battling. We're going to show that in the film. I don't want to go into too much detail, but there was a battle saying, hey, wait a minute. We're not going to just dig ditches with uniforms. We expect to do more than that, because that's what a lot of the Army planners wanted them to do. Just build the roads, dig, you know what a latrine is? Yeah, dig the latrine. That's where you go to the bathroom. Do the kind of lousy, I was going to say crappy jobs. That's not a nice thing to say. But do the really bad jobs. Build the railroads in France. Unload the ships. By the way, all the food that he was talking about and all the ships full of ammunition. Somebody has to unload those ships, put them in the docks, transport them to the lines where the trenches are. There's a gazillion jobs like that. Somebody has to do them, and a lot of African Americans did those, but there was combat jobs, and that was more of even though your life was on the line, that was more of a, it was more of a, it was a sense that if I'm a citizen, even though I'm black, if I actually fought in combat, it was more of a sense of accomplishment. So a lot of them wanted, a combat role. And so the fight was, we want to be soldiers as well. We don't want to just be, doing these kind of subservient roles, just being laborers. So there was kind of a compromise was struck. So they decided to form 2 all-black combat divisions, not integrated, but they were going to have whites as officers, kind of in control of the divisions. But they allowed a compromise of having middle-level black officers. You know what middle level means? Kind of captains and lieutenants. The higher ones would be colonels and majors. Generals are sort of in command of the whole division. And so in doing that, so they had to train them and test them. And so this is what the Fort Des Moines story is. So the guys that trained those middle-level officers, commanding black soldiers, privates and sergeants and corporals, those are the kind of lower-end ones. It's a very rigid system, of command. So that's what the story is at Fort Des Moines. They trained those guys. That's what we're going to get to in the film. But I want to give you that little bit of background. And just a little bit more background, then we'll get to the film, is blacks in the Army prior to the World War I. You've heard of the Emancipation Proclamation from history classes. So part of the Emancipation Proclamation included, during the Civil War, the need for Union soldiers was the legalized the ability to form blacks to join the Union Army. That was part of one of the features of the Emancipation Proclamation, and they were also segregated regiments. Those regiments are roughly 1,200 soldiers. So they called them colored regiments. That was kind of the term they used then. You don't use that term today. That would be considered racist, but that was the term for the time. And so they formed, and then after the war, they allowed 2 cavalry units, that's mounted units, horses, and 2 army units during the Indian Wars. And so they legally in the army as segregated units, and then they expanded that during World War I. So just to give you that little bit of background. Any questions before we show a clip of the film? And I'll kind of wave to you. We're not going to see the whole film, and then we'll talk about some more. Okay? Any questions? So let's see we'll talk about Fort Des Moines now.
100 years ago, over 1,200 African American men, locally and from around the nation, arrived at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, determined to break racial barriers in a segregated U.S. Army. They were the very first class of black officer candidates in America's military, a major chapter in Iowa's history, America's history, and the rich history of our armed forces. African Americans served in every war prior to World War I. They officially became part of the Army during the Civil War in 1862. All black segregated units later fought against Native Americans, who still respectfully nicknamed them Buffalo Soldiers. The military, however, like American society as a whole, offered limited opportunities for the black recruits, who fought to protect the very society that denied them. They would change all that. In the fall of 1917, 639 of these men became lieutenants and captains. They fought in the Great War, World War I, and returned home to fight for their civil rights. This is their story. When World War I began in Europe in 1914, many Americans pushed for a military preparedness program in case the U.S. joined in. The Army organized and held officers' training classes, but only for whites. In April 1917, America entered what was called the Great War, now commonly known as World War I. Even though African Americans entered the draft, American military planners and leaders and American society as a whole believed that blacks lacked the character, intelligence, and bravery to become officers. The U.S. Army eventually, but reluctantly, allowed for 2 all-black combat divisions to be led by white officers. Leaders in the newly formed NAACP pushed the Army to allow for the training of black officers. Heading this effort was Chairman Joel Spingarn, who had finished a white officers training camp, and Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of America's most influential black leaders, an advocate for integration, and editor of the NAACP's monthly magazine, The Crisis. Few in the Army supported the idea, but one advocate was General Leonard Wood. Another was Secretary of War Newton Baker, a member of the Chicago chapter of the NAACP. Du Bois supported segregated black officers camp over no camp at all because he wanted black officers commanding black troops. He wrote, "If this is our country, then this is our war." Black male college students and graduates organized a Central Committee composed primarily of fraternity men at Howard and Harvard universities. They visited their representatives and senators on Capitol Hill, which resulted in Secretary Baker's announcement of the camp's formation at Fort Des Moines in May 1917. The Army organized its first class for black officer candidates in June 1917. Their role was to serve in the all-black combat divisions, commanding field troops, but serving under the white division leaders. Iowa's Governor William Harding expressed enthusiasm for the establishment of the camp in Iowa. He said, "When a race can come out of slavery and in so short a time be recognized as they have been in the establishment of this officers' training camp, it is a tribute to the race as well as to the great principles of representative government." Fort Des Moines offered ample space to hold a camp. It had grown into an attractive facility by World War I. but by then, the facility stood practically empty because most of the troops stationed here had been dispatched to the Mexican border, chasing the elusive revolutionary Pancho Villa. Iowa offered a suitable place to train black officer candidates because it was known to be more racially tolerant than many other states. Many hoped the highest-ranking black officer in the Army, Colonel Charles Young, would command the camp. Instead, this proven Spanish-American War combat veteran was unfairly forced into retirement for high blood pressure, and Colonel Charles Ballou assumed command of the camp. A relatively sympathetic Ballou said to the candidates, "Your race will be on trial, with you as its representatives." Ballou's trainers were white West Point graduates. The trainees' day started with reveille at 5:30. Similar to the white camps, activities consisted of intensive marching and drilling, physical training, infantry ways, and fighting skills, shooting, semaphore training, and trench warfare tactics. Lights out at 9:45. Unlike the other training camps, black candidates and later graduates were denied training in artillery, engineering, and machine guns, which much aggrieved many candidates and damaged morale. Racial strife was minimal in Des Moines, yet to alleviate any potential racial tensions, Ballou organized the White Sparrow Patriotic Ceremony at Drake Stadium on July 22, 1917. The candidates paraded and sang spirituals to 10,000 onlookers who enjoyed the performance. Candidate James Morris of Des Moines said that after the ceremony, "We were rarely hassled by whites at Fort Des Moines or out in the city." Finally, in October, 639 men graduated as captains and lieutenants. They were paid in gold coins, $75. At the same time, another historical first occurred at Fort Des Moines. To fill the medical needs of the two all-black combat divisions, the Army recruited and trained black doctors for the division's medical arm. Thus, the fort's medical camp began shortly after the officer camp began. Both groups trained concurrently and shared buildings and facilities at the fort. 104 physicians and 12 dentists graduated from the 10-week camp, and most worked with the 92nd Division. 89 of them served in France. They organized mobile medical hospitals, infirmaries, supervised medics, and oversaw ambulance services, and took steps to maintain the general health of the troops. As the 92nd Division Buffalo soldiers entered the thick of combat in the late summer of 1918, casualties mounted. Most of the Fort Des Moines graduates joined the 27,000-man 92nd Division, nicknamed the Buffaloes. Their motto, deeds, not words. Officers and soldiers were trained separately stateside under largely segregated conditions at different camps. Many whites feared being outranked by blacks and found the idea of saluting them repulsive. Most of the higher-ranking white officers in the 92nd Division were Southerners, unsupportive of black officers. Hardly a recipe for high morale. In France, they finally received weapons training, though not nearly as much as their white counterparts. The 92nd entered the trench lines in eastern France for patrolling and scouting duties, until they were rushed to the Meuse-Argonne region, the site of America's huge offensive at the final stages of the war. The 93rd Division, in which a few Fort Des Moines graduates served, had a markedly different experience. They were among the first American troops to arrive in France. They fought with the French Army, and many wore French helmets and used French arms. The most decorated black unit of the war was the 369th Regiment, the so-called Harlem Hellfighters, a New York National Guard unit, part of the 93rd Division. From this hard-fighting, highly decorated unit, its regimental band led by James Reese Europe introduced Europeans to a new musical art form, jazz. A few Fort Des Moines graduates served in all-black units that became known as services of supply. One historian called them laborers in uniform, or the military equivalent of chain gangs, performing such tasks as building roads and latrines, digging ditches, disposing garbage, and caring for animals. They received very little training, comparatively low pay, and hard treatment. The worst job was graves registration, finding, recording, and reburying the dead. This grim but important work took care of thousands of those killed in action. About 1/3 of all labor troops were blacks, a total of about 160,000.
I know you want to see the rest of it, but it kind of profiles individuals, and I think you got the idea. I'm also glad you got to see footage. Have any of you ever seen what we call black and white film footage? You're so probably used to color, yeah. But color had not really been. I'm pretty sure color had not even been developed yet. I know we have a film at Fort Des Moines about World War II, and it was just beginning to be introduced. I just wanted to end with a couple of just general thoughts, what I meant to say earlier. Also, the U.S. was also entangled with our allies because they didn't agree on a lot of things about how to wage the war once America started throwing its weight around and we started bringing in a lot of troops. As how we were going to wage the war. The British, by the way, didn't want anything to do with having black troops integrated with their units at all. And there's a big battle with the main American general. His name was John J. Pershing. The British just wanted American bodies. Their basic philosophy, I'm kind of simplifying this, was just give us the guys. We'll clothe them, we'll give them a rifle. They'll take the place of the British that get killed in action. And, no identification of an American army, just British uniforms, even though our helmets were just like theirs. Basically, as I understand, I think they manufactured most of the Americans' helmets anyway because we didn't have time to really design new helmets and put them in use anyway. So that was their philosophy, in which General Pershing found repugnant. And he was backed by President Wilson. It was basically General Pershing's view was, we will have an American sector in the trenches, and we will work in concert with the French and British, and when we do offensives and actions, but we will control our own troops. The French were a little more flexible on that, but they were also more amenable to having black troops. And the reason why is related to what our first speaker, Amy, was talking about, with imperialism. The French had African colonies, and they were bringing some of those Africans in their troops. And they were fighting on the front already. So they were actually used to dealing with blacks troops already from the Congo and some other countries. I may have those countries wrong. Senegal, I believe. And so they were already used to that. And so they actually were quite, comparatively speaking, welcoming the African-American troops. So if you may have seen some of the black troops wearing these helmets that look like firemen's hats. Well, those were not American. I mean, they were Americans, but they weren't in American uniforms. And so they're actually fighting with the French. And so they must have had French guys that could speak English, and so that's kind of a nice side story. And they were among the first units to get there. Was a French was the African American regiment. So Pershing didn't know what to do with them. So the French said, "We'll take them." They're the ones that did very well. I just wanted to add that.